So welcome everyone again to our third and final webinar on DCYF Integrated Strategic and Racial Equity Plan. And our priority strategy that we're focusing in on today is our goal to create successful transitions into adulthood, and just really facilitate and listen to you all to hear how this priority strategy will support you and your communities, and just to hear how we can best partner in implementing this strategy. So I will. Great. And one of the things we like to do in opening up the meeting as well is to acknowledge the land. Again, my name is Yvette Jasper, and I'm here in Tacoma, Washington, occupying Puyallup tribal lands. And I would love to pass it on to Talina to do a land acknowledgement.
Great, thank you, Yvette. I join you from the territory of my ancestors, acknowledging the land and the people before us who took care of this land, and with the courage that still remains as stewards of this land for Indigenous people that have and still thrive in this territory since time immemorial. I encourage you to share in the chat whose traditional lands you join us from. So as Betty had shared, you would want to choose all panelists and attendees. That will allow us some practice to be able to use in the chat, an opportunity for you to be able to share with us whose territory and land are you joining us from today. So as we ascend into an open future beyond inclusion, it's important for us to remember that all of our gatherings take place on the traditional lands of Indigenous people. I am thankful that we share this time together in a virtual place, especially as we use technology right now, which seems so invisible at times, yet it also occupies space that connects us, just like the web of life. Imagine encouraging you to imagine the cedars and the deep roots that connect them to the communications that they have with each other and the supports together. Those fine lines, the mycelium and the mushrooms that carry their messages, and apply that to our online community here. Recognizing the air that we share, the satellites in the sky, the ground cords and the wires that connect us into our homes. The water, the air, and the land that we share is a gift that tells the story of what has happened before us. And among Indigenous peoples, appropriate protocol involves recognizing the peoples and the land upon which a gathering takes place shortly before public speaking. I'm thankful that this tradition is being carried on and is part of my traditional protocols as a S'Klallam person joining you from the lands of the Port Madison Indian Reservation, where I recognize that I'm a guest. We do this both because it's culturally appropriate for us to do, but it also expresses our gratitude for being a guest on the lands whose presence makes an impact on our lives, recognizing the land as our teacher and not just as a political acknowledgement, to continue to honor the presence and the continuous occupation of Indigenous people, and brings us a step towards a reconciliation process. Thank you for allowing me this time to be able to share a brief land acknowledgement in a way that is meaningful, where we refuse to historicize narratives of the Indigenous people so that we can consider how we can invest in the permanence of a nation state that has normally denied sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. For those of you who are interested in learning more about land acknowledgement, I'll share a little bit in the chat with you for some additional resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Talina, for opening up our space well. So I'm going to introduce our DCYF Leadership, who will be panelists for the conversation today. So they'll each introduce themselves during the portion of the webinar where we're introducing the priority strategy. But I just want to acknowledge our cross-agency team present here today: Kathleen Harvey from Community Reentry and Parole Programs, Talina Ives from our Office of Tribal Relations, Rebecca Kelly from Juvenile Rehabilitation, Jess Lewis from Adolescent Programs, Harvey Perez from our institution programs, and Vicki Ibarra from our Office of Innovation, Alignment, and Accountability. And I will actually pass it on to Vicki to get us started.
Thanks, Yvette. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. It's great to see so many people who've joined us for this important discussion. I just wanted to ground us in sort of where we are in DCYF and our strategic plan, now our integrated strategic and racial equity plan. We started down the journey of creating the first agency strategic plan over a year ago, and it was January of last year that we posted our initial draft after months of work inside the agency. That initial draft was intended to be the starting point for discussions with communities and stakeholders around the state and to inform what would eventually be the agency's final strategic plan. I believe we had a goal of publishing a final in April of 2019. We did start down the road of external input into the draft that was posted and is still posted on the agency website. We had an external survey and had a few external conversations. But because the world changed, we did not have an opportunity to finish the path we started. And in fact, like much of our work inside the agency and around the state and the nation, had to make some pretty significant adjustments in our expectations for what we could accomplish. So mid-year, after we had a chance to deal with some of the emergencies of COVID, we did a regrouping over the summer and early fall inside the agency. We did a few things. We looked at the external feedback we had received to date through the survey and through the few presentations that we'd been able to do. We took a look at where we were, and we also took a look at what the initial priorities were that we'd identified and how the work might have been impacted by both COVID and the learnings we'd had from the emergency, as well as potentially from the upcoming recession that the state is in and budget constraints. And what we've come up with is now an approach that integrates our strategic and racial equity plan. This was some of the strongest early external feedback we had, was that these two plans need to be integrated. Initially, they were two separate plans on two separate timelines, with the racial equity plan on a longer timeline to allow for substantial affected community input. So we've lengthened the timeline overall, integrated the plan, reaffirmed the initial intention and capacity priorities, added a new first and overarching priority related to equity and eliminating racial ethnic disparities. So you'll see now on the single page, front page draft that's included on this slide, our initial intention priorities that have all been reaffirmed. The only change here is that the initial birth to 5 is now birth to 8. And then our two capacity priorities, improving quality and availability of provider services. So the plan will now have one overarching equity priority, 3 intention priorities, and 2 capacity priorities. We're here today specifically to talk about the intention priority of creating successful transitions into adulthood for youth and young adults in our care. And I look forward to that discussion. The way we've structured the draft document, and you'll see a new draft up hopefully next week, reflecting our latest thinking and input, with the goal of having a final posted on the website in early April after incorporating additional feedback. What we call priority areas can be thought of as goals. I'm sorry. Background noise. These can be thought of as goals: eliminating racial disproportionalities, safely reducing the number of children in care, creating successful transitions to adulthood. These are goals. And then the focused areas of work are more how we do our work. So we're looking forward to the feedback we'll have today. I can also just to update you on the timeline on the next slide. This next slide illustrates sort of where we've been in developing our first ever agency integrated strategic and racial equity plan, and where we are now. We are at the point of having our third intention webinar. That's what we're doing today, and we're going to continue through March to seek targeted feedback from communities of color and affected individuals, with the plan of having a final version of the strategic plan posted on the website in early April. Thanks for the opportunity to recount where we've come from to get to this point, and I'm going to turn it back over to Yvette. Thanks.
So, good afternoon. I'm LaToya Homsware again. I'm glad to be here with you all today. So I'm going to start with how we decided to move forward in supporting our new first priority. And as you see on this slide, it talks about the root causes of racial disparities and disproportionality and how we got here. So we always think and talk about how important it is to ground ourselves in DCYF's commitment to racial equity and social justice and why they exist and how we got here. And the disparities and disproportionalities are not a result of individual choices. And so as you see in this chart that we have here and also embedded in our strategic plan, it talks about how things happen on the individual scale, the interpersonal scale, institutional, and systemic. And so when we talk about how do we uproot our racial disparities and disproportionality, is really looking at all parts of that and really diving and digging into the systemic area of what the root causes of what's going on. We know that these things are by design, so we must proactively redesign with the most marginalized at the center so our systems are serving all community members. So this is what you'll see as you look at our strategic plan and the conversation we have around how do we get to the root causes of the racial disparities and disproportionality. Next slide. Also, in eliminating racial disproportionalities and advancing racial equity, we have these three focused areas of work for the new equity priority strategy, which is designed to build DCYF's capacity to become an anti-racist, pro-liberation organization and contribute to the racial justice movement. There are specific actions we know we must take now to eliminate bias in assessments and programs, and there are actions we must co-create with communities who are most impacted, centering the experiences of BIPOC children, youth, and families. There's also the work DCYF must do to acknowledge and heal from trauma our agency is or has been responsible for causing. And so when we look at everything, when we're talking about the causes of things, we always have to also talk about the trauma that's been caused, but also the healing that is necessary to move forward. We also are designing our work around a mantra that our office uses, which is, there's nothing about us without us is for us. And this slogan was popularized by South African disability rights and youth activists. And we truly believe that we can't tell people how to do the work. We have to be there to support them in it because the ones who are affected know best what will work for them. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Jess.
Good afternoon. I'm super happy to join you all today. I am really excited also to see that there are 132 people listening in. This is clearly something that I am very passionate about, and I'm glad there's so much interest. You'll often hear folks describe DCYF as kind of in their toddler stage. We're about 2 years old as an integrated organization. And if you apply that analogy to adolescent programs, we're kind of still in our infancy. We've been around for about 1.5 years. And in that time, we've really been thinking about what does it mean to successfully transition youth into adulthood and how can we best fulfill the promise of 1661 and really think about the services that we're providing to youth and improving outcomes across the board. Adolescent programs has a kind of a unique charge because we don't really care if where you enter or exit a system. We are concerned about all youth who are served by DCYF, and also we're thinking about things like prevention as well. And so I have the opportunity to not really worry about statutory authority when it comes to serving kids. And so we get to think about the whole kind of spectrum of youth that we come into contact with or potentially come into contact with. So our work has really been oriented around two things, two reports that came about right at my perfect developmental stage. One of those was the Youth in Crisis Report, which was published by DCYF right before I started in 2019. My sense of time is a little off with COVID. So, and that really called for us to think about adolescent services and adolescent programs in an integrated way. Knowing that there's a huge intersection between child welfare and JR, as well as our prevention efforts and our efforts to provide services before kids need to get into the deep end of our systems. So that really oriented the work very early on. And then there was a 6560 report around preventing or the prohibition against exiting youth into homelessness from state systems. And that really has dictated how the division has come into being and how we've grown, and also where our trajectory is. So our goal is really to create an integrated system of support and service delivery that's rooted in our clients' developmental needs, right? So what would the world look like if we were youth-centered and client-centered in our program design and development? What would it look like if we revisited our policies and processes and procedures from a youth-centered perspective, asking youth to be active participants in the development of those? And also, what would it look like if we looked at all of the things that we've developed over time from a proactive approach of removing either intentional or unintentional bias from those practices. And then ultimately our goal is to improve long-range adolescent outcomes across the board. So whether that's housing or employment or educational opportunities, we know that all of those things are deeply ingrained and integrated into a youth's overall outcomes. For example, we know based on a Chapin Hall study that if you do not graduate from high school with a high school diploma or GED, you are 346% more likely to be homeless as a young adult. So clearly education is a critical factor in making sure that youth transition successfully into adulthood. Can I have the next slide, please? So to organize our work, and you should be very thankful because my colleagues keep discouraging me from sharing org charts because that's how my brain works. So rather than org charts, I'm going to share our work kind of organized in three pillars. So the first pillar is really about preventing additional trauma. So we know that we have youth who come into our systems because they've experienced trauma in their families and communities. And so our ultimate goal is to not do additional harm once we have those kids with us, right? Within this work, we are embedding our racial equity and social justice work. So that person will be responsible for integrating this work across the entire division and really making sure that those folks are, that my team is proactively working to be an anti-racist division. Our youth empowerment work is embedded in this, mentoring and youth development. So how are we then building relationships to help reinforce the equity work that we're doing system-wide? The second pillar is really centered around trauma-centered healing. So when we have youth and we're not doing additional harm, how do we then help them heal from the trauma that they've experienced? And so that's really about building a systems of care framework within adolescent programs, which many of you may know is a public health model, but it's really around how do we provide supports and partnerships for building community capacity to provide the services that are most healing, again, all from a youth-centered perspective. And then the third pillar is really around supportive adult relationships. So that's where career-connected pathways, education, our post-secondary supports, and our independent living skills programs live. So the way that I describe this is that we have a system that doesn't do the best job of helping to foster supportive adult relationships. We have pockets, but from a systems perspective, we struggle in this regard sometimes. And so we need to build a system around helping youth develop a relationship with one person with 3 traits, right? So if you blow a tire at 2 o'clock in the morning, you need to know one person with 3 characteristics. You need to know someone who will answer their phone at 2 a.m. They need to be willing to get out of bed and come to wherever you are. And they need to know how to teach you how to change a tire. Because if you're 20, probably your other three tires are bald too, right? I remember one year I got tires for Christmas and it was super exciting. But if you just know someone who will answer their phone at 2 a.m., but they don't know how to change a tire, then that's not the right person for you to connect to in that situation. And so we're really thinking about, in adolescent programs, how do we build an infrastructure to help youth identify these supportive adults and help nurture and sustain and foster those relationships? But also, how do you resolve conflict? And how do you make amends? And how do you work through those challenges that every relationship brings? So those are our three pillars in adolescent programs. Okay, can I have the next? And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Kelly. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary for Juvenile Rehabilitation, and I, along with my colleagues, are going to walk you through a couple other slides about how we in juvenile rehabilitation are focusing on this priority area of creating successful transitions to adulthood. This first slide is really about our new area of focus, or expanded area of focus, I should say. Up until 2018, in juvenile rehabilitation, we served young people all the way up to age 21. With the passage of 2 pieces of legislation in 2018 and 2019, we have expanded that population now up to age 25. And so what you see here is this is a new area of opportunity for us, and a new area that we get to address emerging young adult needs. And if you look at the slide on the chart on the right, you'll see that when we break down our JR population of over 18, that we have 74% are youth of color compared to 26% who are white. And if you look at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you'll see our total population JR, which reflects 64% of our young people are youth of color compared to 36% who are white. And when we know in the general population of this age group, it's about the reverse of that. It's about 30% who are youth of color and 70% who are white. And so that just goes to show you, this is a framework that we use throughout our slides, that we have the young people who are coming into our care have faced systemic racism, and it gets deeper and greater the deeper they get into the system. And so when you look at the young people who are in that emerging adult population, they are the greatest number of people who have adult sentences and long sentences, and have faced the greatest disparities and racism in the system. So it's just another compelling factor of something that we need to attend to in our work. We have to be very deliberate and action oriented, and making sure that every aspect of our care and our services and programs that we're looking at, how well are we doing with addressing the needs of all young people, and are we having equitable access to these different programs and services throughout. So for our emerging adults, we are looking at, you'll see a couple of check boxes that we have here on this slide about some of the work that we've done to date around expanding post-secondary education, getting access to secure laptops with good programming on it, increasing our vocational programming. These have check boxes, but they are also things that are still in progress. We are continuing to need to expand how well we're doing and what we are offering to our young people to help them with that successful transition. And there are things that we've moved and put into progress since this legislation has been put in place, and actually had begun before that to address our 18, 19, and 20, 21-year-olds. Areas that we still need to develop are around transformational peer mentoring, parenting support programs, and independent living skills, which you just heard Jess talk about with changing tires. That's a great example of when types of things that we need to be able to help young people be prepared for. I'll go to the next slide, please. Another area of focus for us in juvenile rehabilitation is around our reentry team meetings. And this is a way that it's a youth and family driven process. It's similar to wraparound team meetings or family team decision meetings that exist in child welfare. And it is a holistic approach with the people that the youth and family want to have at the table, who will help, our natural supports that help them sustain and connect to their community and the resources they need when they go back to their communities, and is very holistic. You see at the top of the screen the areas of focus that we cover when we do our reentry team meetings. And when we look at how well we're doing, we look at our release reentry team meetings, the data on the right-hand side of the screen, and we are doing pretty well with achieving release RTMs 45 to 60 days prior to release, so that young people can have a plan when they walk out the door. We see reentry plans, 98%. We want to make sure that young people are prepared. They know where their doctor is, what doctor they need to go to, how their mentor is going to help connect to them, who's going to be the person who's going to help them change the tire if they need to at 2 o'clock in the morning. So this, again, is just another way that we are supporting young people with a plan for their successful transition. I'm going to go to the next slide, please. This is just another slide that shows how we are addressing career pathways. We all know that figuring out our way forward to identify a career, our educational, vocational needs, figuring out a job path is kind of tough, let alone if you're in a juvenile facility and you're already facing multiple hurdles in multiple domains, educational gaps, behavioral health challenges, now a record. And so the educational, employment, and vocational training for young people in JR is critical to provide them with opportunities for success upon release that result in living wage jobs. And so one thing that we've done is in partnership with Pack Mountain Workforce Development Council and the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation is this program called My Jobs, which provides employment coordinators to help assist young people with employment interest and job readiness, searching, job placement, job retention. And so that's a great beginning. And then we also help to connect them in other ways with education, vocational readiness, and employment. And you'll hear more about that, I think, in the next slide. But these are really key things. We know that without jobs, when young people go back to their communities, or without a certification for employment or an educational pathway, that it's a lot harder to make a go of it as being a successful adult in the community. So this is a really key area of some of the work that we're doing in juvenile rehabilitation. And I'll turn it over to Kathleen next.
Oh, great. So off the heels of kind of overarching what Jess talked about when we're talking about building an integrated system And then also what Rebecca was highlighting around pathways, we wanted to spotlight kind of an island of excellence. In 2014, we received a grant from the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention to try out a manufacturing academy pre-apprenticeship program that was delivered by the Aerospace Joint Apprenticeship along with community college. So we decided that we were going to invest in young people. We are on cohort 20 now, and we have implemented a 14-week apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeship program with many young people that earn 7 industry recognized certifications. On the right, you will see that there is an actual study that was produced by the Office of Innovation, and you can find that report on their website that talks about the wage outcomes. The green line highlights for those young people, and I hope I get this right, so I'm glad Vicki is on the call as well, but that the wage is not $305, so for the first bar, it's actually above $305 above the baseline for young people releasing back into their community and securing employment. One of the other key factors around pre-apprenticeship is we need to not just invest in one pre-apprenticeship program, we really need to look at interest and long-term investments in career. What do young people, what are they interested in? What are they invested in terms of career development and career opportunities in the future? The other key piece is in the cohorts over the last 20 of them, 72% of the participants were youth of color. We have been able to issue about 1,400 college credits, as well as about 766 industry recognized certifications. On that note, next slide, please. So another key piece, again, I think in the work of adolescent services is homeless youth prevention strategies. JR several years ago actually was able to get some dedicated supports for young people. It was off the heels of what was referenced as Senate Bill 6560 for young people to not release into homelessness. There is a previous study that was done that identified young people releasing from JR, about 25% experienced homelessness. We actually believe that that percentage is higher because what is not taken into consideration is couch surfing or other temporary housing. And we're really looking at safe, stable, and permanent housing for future success. Here are some key categories that we focused on when we were trying to build up supports for young people leaving juvenile rehabilitation. Foundation is key. First, providing training and information and education to staff and managers. Having some dedicated staff to actually help identify where young people are struggling, what geographic areas, what partnerships need to be created, and then also referral and response. How do we actually identify young people and then link them to the necessary supports in the community? The approach obviously is working with in a statewide capacity with the 6560 report contributors and also being involved in an interagency work group. Community partnerships, we cannot do any of this alone, and we clearly know that. To date, we have established about 18 housing vendors across the state. The rental vouchers, actually that number is probably a little bit higher at this point, but we don't just offer rental assistance. We also know that many young people leaving JR have never actually lived on their own. And so really spending some time talking about what their basic needs are and also connecting them to those resources. One other key aspect of the 6560 work is that young people actually need to have a Washington State identification card in order to kind of maneuver and through their journey back into the community. And so we have a process with the Department of Licensing where we can actually secure a Washington State ID for all young people releasing from juvenile rehabilitation. And at the bottom, as it's referenced, 100% of young people need to have a safe and stable place to live, to grow, and to prosper. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk in the next couple slides about the capacity for community facilities. As many people know, a lot of people know about juvenile rehabilitation with secure confinement or institutions. And Harvey Perez, the institution director, will be able to share a little bit about some of the work that's being done in institutions. However, we do have a step down, least restrictive, supportive environment across the state. It is small in capacity. We currently, 75% of young people in JR serve their sentence at an institution or secure confinement, and about 25% capacity in a community-based facility. There are 8 community facilities, 5 on the east side of the state and 3 on the west side of the state. And as referenced in the chart, 62% of young people remain in the institution. So you're looking at a very small percentage, not even 40% actually get the opportunity to be in a least restrictive setting in the community. One value add for community facilities is young people work, go to school, have meaningful family connection, may actually go on leave and go home to their families. They are involved in community involvement passes in the community. They just stay at the community facility and they are learning skills while they're at the community facility as well. When you look at the race, ethnicity, and obviously in order to address racial ethnic disparities, we have to disaggregate the data to continue to learn and improve and evolve when we're talking about where the barriers or hurdles are. So for the community facilities, we serve approximately 63% of the youth of color in community facilities now. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about some work that we are working on in this legislative session to try to stand up and support additional resources for a step down programs. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families has supported a few decision packages this legislative session. The legislative session for JR focuses on 2 decision packages. Harvey will talk a little bit more about the second decision package. This decision package talks about least restrictive environments for young people. And it has a whole host of items in here. One of the first areas is expand community facility capacity. Give young people an opportunity to practice in a supported environment in the community and be engaging in community activities, programs, services, resources in the most natural setting possible, and help support them as they transition back into the community and into adulthood. The second part of the least restrictive package talks about community transition services, or really creating an opportunity for young people to serve their legal obligation in lieu of incarceration or secure incarceration. So we do have agency request legislation right now to to alter the statutory or the legal requirements that currently exist to allow for supported community transition services based in the community. Young people will have access to needed services based on risk, needs, and a responsivity model. The third area talks about expanded reentry aftercare supports for all young people. There is a evaluation that the Office of Innovation has also done to really look at what do young people need as they enter back into the community and while they're with us. One key area was provide transition supports for all young people. Currently, we have about 48% of young people releasing to parole aftercare supports. The other half of the population actually released directly from a residential setting with no identified navigation, case management, or critical services needed to be successful in the future. So part of this package really supports providing that, that network and that resource package for young people to be successful. And that includes housing voucher, potentially housing vouchers, treatment services, connections to some of the things that are needed in order for them to transition successfully. And then the last component of the expanded least restrictive option is to take a look at our risk, needs, and actuarial assessment tools. Currently, these assessment tools identify and determine when young people release, whether they have access or eligibility to a community facility. And so we are currently in the process. There is a work group and a leadership from the research team to really identify where there are racial disparities within the risk assessment tool and to revamp and redesign the risk assessment tool so it's more predictive and it also eliminates some of those racial barriers that are currently in existence. So I'm going to kick it over to Harvey Perez, the Director of Institution Programs, for the final decision package conversation.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good afternoon, Harvey Perez, Director of Institution Programs, and I'm glad to be part of today's presentation. And so I will discuss further around the strategy that we focused on with the second decision package. And I think the first thing to say is that it is pretty well documented that rates of substance abuse and mental health disorders are disproportionately high among just, and the state of Washington and JR is no exception to that. And so, so as we were looking at strategies to move youth into successful transitions, we recognize the importance of ensuring that we provide the appropriate level of substance use treatment and mental health treatment. And the department back in 2019, the DCYF Research Office did an evaluation to look at our substance use treatment and dialectical behavior therapy, which I'll refer to as DBT. And they did an analysis which really helped inform us as far as where we were at in those two treatment areas. And what it identified was that we had a treatment gap for substance use disorder. And it identified that 56% of youth that have been identified as needing treatment were not receiving treatment. So we recognized we had a treatment gap related to substance use. And so part of the really to address that gap. We recognize that every youth who's assessed as needing treatment ought to receive that appropriate level of treatment. And so that part of the decision package would really fund us additional SUD professionals to be able to provide comprehensive assessments with SUD treatment. So any youth that comes into JR within 1 hour of intake is screened for substance use. And it will identify initially if a youth or a young person appears to have a substance use, and then we do a full, should be doing a full comprehensive assessment, then start to provide substance use treatment. So again, this component is really to address that, and so we need additional SUD professionals to be able to do that work. In addition to that, we also know that we serve those at our 3 secure facilities, but then we also know that our young people either release to a community facility or they release back to their communities, and some of our youth go to parole. So we wanted to also have a component for community-based contracted substance use support navigators, basically navigators to help support youth as they transition back into their home communities. And so that's the focus around that part of the decision package. The other one that I want to speak to is around DBT, and it's really to provide targeted DBT to our young people with the highest mental health needs. The study that was done by the research office highlighted that we were not providing the full modes of treatment for DBT. There's been good intent, but the reality is we don't have sufficient staffing to be able to provide all that treatment. And so what happens is with the staff that we have, there are different responsibilities, and part of one of the primary importance is to ensure the health and safety of our residents. So staff have to provide custody and supervision responsibilities, but then we were also tasking them to also do DBT. And so the reality was we were not able to do that. And so the report had identified that of the youth in 2014 and 15 who left JR, only 57% of the youth had received some level of treatment of our DBT, and that only 4% of the youth who left actually received all our treatment modes. And so, you know, part of our DBT is to provide individual sessions. We're supposed to do skills group, look at our living environment and making sure that it's a therapeutic environment. And then we're supposed to provide consultation staff teams to provide support to our staff in order to ensure that we're addressing any type of supports that they need as they deliver those. And so the reality is that was a gap we've identified. And so rather than trying to do DBT for everyone, we're going to target youth with the highest mental health needs, and they will receive all modes of treatment. But in order to do that, we really need dedicated DBT specialists. So this decision package would really fund us for those DBT specialists to be able to do all those modes of treatment. And then that will also free up some of our staff time to be able to focus. We still want them to focus on the living environment. We know how important it is to create a therapeutic environment. But we also have a lot of work around reentry and other rehabilitative services that staff could adhere to. And so, so that's the intent of this decision package. Ultimately, we know that our young people cannot be successful in reaching their education, employment, and other goals if they're struggling with their behavioral health needs. And so again, the intent is to really provide the necessary treatment for behavioral health. So with that, I will pass it back to, I think, Hannah. I think we're wrapped up with the slides.
So I think Talina was going to speak a little bit on the intersection with the Office of Tribal Relations and some of the strategies for successfully transitioning youth.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be able to share some testimonies and some of the great work that the agency is already undergoing in our initiatives in the strategic plan. Want to be able to highlight some of the ways that we want to continue to work in partnership to enhance the availability of the services and supports that we provide to our youth. And Also want to recognize our adolescence programs and Peggy Lewis, who runs our ILS program, where youth can be anywhere on the spectrum of transitioning into adulthood, where the Department of Children, Youth, and Families contracts with local community-based agencies and federally recognized tribes throughout the state to provide independent living skills. And some of these services to support this could include the Casey Life Skills Assessment, daily living skills, educational support, career exploration, VOC training, job placement and retention, and funding to be able to assist for IL enrichment activities related to the youth IL goals. And I'm also going to direct your attention into the chat box where you can find more information about that. We also know through our culturally appropriate mentorship opportunities that we have some really exciting work that has been happening through Mentor Washington and through partnerships with Boeing and the Nisqually tribe and Wahilu and River Ridge High School, a wonderful mentorship program that we have also highlighted in a recent news release from DCYF and also from Boeing as well, on a Native American Career Connect STEM mentorship program. So those are some examples of ways that we are partnering with communities to be able to provide the supports in culturally appropriate mentoring and career connections. So that is also available in the chat for more information. Also really thankful too that we have recently hired a half-time position to support the work as a JR tribal liaison. Brandy Otto joins us, who has several years experience in child welfare and also in juvenile rehabilitation. So JR, in her role with JR as that tribal liaison, she's new in that position. She's also shared a little testimony that I want to be able to share in the success of a youth coming out of Nacelle who was reintroduced to his tribe. And through the reintroduction to his tribe was able to help him with transition to his mom's house. And it's very new, and next week he'll be home for a week, really exciting. The tribe has rallied around this youth and offered him services, and most of all supports him and his mother and their needs in success for being in community. So just wanted to be able to share a testimony of the great work that is happening, and also the tribal partnerships that we have are essential for us to be able to wrap around our youth. We also support this work through residential custody service agreements. And through these custody service agreements, we provide residential custody services to youth who have been sentenced by tribal courts, whom the tribe and JR deem appropriate for placement in JR residential facilities, with the agreement that rehabilitation is the primary goal for all services through these agreements, and similarly focusing on the priority of supporting tribal heritage through cultural services in JR facilities. So just wanting to reiterate that this is some of the work that we're already doing and undergoing in our initiatives that support this strategic plan. Most of all, it wouldn't be possible without the partnership of our tribal communities and identified staff that value and support culturally appropriate programs and services. Thank you for allowing me some time. I believe that I am passing it back over to, is it Day?
It's me. Thanks, Talina. And thank you all so much for the wealth of information that you all provided. There are so many great questions actually that were originally in the chat and moved over to Q&A. And I know there's a couple of hands raised as well, but before we move on to the Q&A section, we want to ask folks if there's any clarifying questions that you all have so far. Some of the questions have been responded to by panelists in the Q&A, and there's a nice handful of questions around addressing youth experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to try to sync those up a little bit, but just that we would look and see. I know that Emily and Betty are also handling the hand raising component. There's just All right, so we're going to go ahead and launch into our first question. And as Michelle is still on, I've already emailed the panelists on your behalf with your question. So that is kind of off our live Q&A list here. But Karen asks a question that I actually think is really good for both JR, OTR, and AP staff here. And it asks us, what is being done to create a coordinated way for DCYF staff, DCYF to collaborate with adult-supported living systems? There's an MOU and established practice with DDA, but this needs ongoing work. So the same with youth who have chronic mental health issues require lifelong support, which limit their ability to find and keep employment and housing. So what are those, what are ways that we can collaborate more with adult support living systems? I don't know, who wants to take a stab at that one first? But Harvey just took a drink, so not him. So Jess, I'm going to toss to you first.
Thanks, Day. So we talk about this a lot, and how to, particularly in the context of designing systems around youth who are really going to have the hardest time with those transitions, right? So one of the things that we are trying to accomplish through conversations with DDA, but also with our folks and across community, is how do we engage earlier in those transition conversations so that we can build those bridges more fluidly and have softer hands-off between systems or among systems. So whether that's engaging folks in providing consultation services so that we know what resources are available for youth and can connect them further upstream, or whether that's actually figuring out how to transition youth between systems in a more strategic and, quite frankly, kind way, right? We create lots of small transitions along the way, and what we want to do is make sure that the youth is in a position where the kid doesn't need to know where they are in that system, right? We don't want to disrupt services to start services again. And so we have a lot of work to do in this area. I've seen several bills come through the legislature this session, just trying to address this issue. And I think that we are making progress in our relationships, but as with all things, it's really relationship based. And so we're doing the good work to move it forward.
Thank you, Jess.
And this is Talina. I can share when Day mentioned maybe OTR can also chime in on here. OTR is our Office of Tribal Relations, and just wanted to share a way that I see our coordination in support here is through attending per tribal leader request, the newly formed, or the last 2 or 3 years, Tribal Leader Social Service Council. And that is a way for us to de-silo our agencies to bring together the areas where we intersect. And those meetings have been occurring on a regular basis and are still working on being formalized. But it gets us as agencies really talking and bringing tribes together so that we're able to serve our community in the same way without having to go from agency to agency, but to be together and hear the voice of community and tribes at the same time. Thank you.
I would also just highlight, just in the journey to expand the age population in juvenile rehab, it was hard enough before to be serving young people through the age of 20, because some systems are very focused on 18 and under, and then you have to go elsewhere for the adult services, a different group of people, depending on what organization or entity that you're partnering with. So I think it's an evolution for us internally and how we look to expand services, specifically with housing supports and what all is needed to, supported employment and things like that. But it's also even more of a challenge or barrier for that individual when in JR, they may be looked at as a young person or young adult, but in the rest of the world service delivery model, it's separated at that 18-year mark. And we know that things don't just change at the age of 18, or at least all of us have walked that journey ourselves. And we don't just wake up, on the 18th birthday and we feel like an adult and we make decisions and we have access and all those kinds of things. So I think there's some growing pains in this framework. And we are very excited that Jess and her team are going to clear the path for us as we start to reintroduce ourselves in DCYF to agencies that we've been partnering with in kind of silos.
Thank you to all three of you. I'm just going to include one more question here from the Q&A before we look for raised hands. And again, Michelle has left the webinar, but I think the question is relevant to the things that we're talking about, and other folks probably are interested in the answer as well. And it's really about the increase of development around the independent and transitional living skills programs. And so do any of you know if any of the recently allocated government funding will be earmarked to address the lack of long-term adolescent placements? And are there viable opportunities when considering options to alleviate this disparity?
Yes. So the new allocated funding, we don't have a lot. We don't have a box around yet, and so we have been having a lot of conversations, particularly in the housing space. So in adolescent programs, I have a guy, and that's really exciting. My housing program manager is really there to look at the entire service array for adolescent housing, from where we're placing kids to transition successfully, long-term supportive housing. What are the implications of actually having those bridge ages like Kathleen talked about? So some of our places will take you up to 18, and then some 18 to 21. And then, so what does it look like to actually map what our service array is? And his primary job, right, is to find the holes. So where do we need to help build those bridges? We have an active collaboration with the Office of Homeless Youth, and they have been phenomenal partners in helping us really address barriers around youth who are systems involved and eligibility in federally funded, state funded, or HUD funded programs. Kim Justice has been a great partner in that effort, and her staff is, we have similar operating philosophies as far as like, this doesn't make any sense, can we fix it? Which I very much appreciate. So there's looking at developing the housing array, and then we have this influx of funding that we are trying to leverage in order to open up some doors for youth that have not been present. So for example, there are federal funding or federal housing vouchers that our youth are potentially eligible for that we have not been successful in securing because of a case management requirement. And so we're looking at alternative ways or creative or innovative ways that we can actually provide case management services to youth as they transition out of our system so that they become eligible for those programs. So we're in the process right now of identifying barriers to youth and housing, particularly permanent supportive housing or long-term supportive housing, and then where we can actually address those either through our policy or kind of leaning on other folks to look at how we can bridge services. I will say that youth housing has been chronically underfunded forever. And this is an area where we desperately need folks we need the state and the federal government to invest in this space so that we actually have places to put kids, right? So we need housing availability, and particularly in that younger age range, it just isn't there. And so the Office of Homeless Youth has done a tremendous job of creating and nurturing those programs. But the bottom line is that if it's not there, we can't use it, right? So we're trying to identify those and then enhance and amplify opportunities there.
Thanks, Jess. I know we're getting really close to the end of our time together, and we've got a couple more things to go through. I'm wondering if we have, I don't know how many hands are raised. Betty, I'm looking at you. If folks still have their hands raised up, if we want to take one question and then move on to our poll. Don't see? No, okay. Why don't we go ahead and Yvette, I'm going to hand it back to you to move us through our poll. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We are tracking the chat, and we'll be providing links to the documents with the recording of the webinar once it's posted on our website. I see Greg Williamson from the Housing Program Manager from Justice Shop has posted his email as well. If you folks have more questions around that, we can email, contact Greg directly.
Great, thank you. So I'm about to launch a poll, and we're just doing this pulse check on the priorities, and the question that we're asking is, how well do you think this priority strategy will support the children, youth, and families in your communities? So I'm going to go ahead and launch it, and it ranges from not supportive at all to extremely supportive, just to give our leaders some data on that. I'll leave it open for about a couple minutes. All right, so we just going to give an update. So we have about over 60% participating so far. About 60% of the folks who are responding are saying very supportive. About 12% extremely supportive. A little under 30% somewhat supportive. No, not supportive at all. So we still have people responding. All right, so it looks like it's slowed down. And I will go ahead and pause and share the results. So there's also, we're also asking this question in the survey for folks who weren't able to join, or if you want to also respond to that. So there's another way to share how you're feeling. All right, so I'll go ahead and share. So, yep, the majority of folks, we have still about 100 people participating, and about 60% are saying very supportive, somewhat supportive, or extremely supportive, well, 12%. So, yeah, if you want to share your comments in the chat, or if anyone wants to share their, response as to why they responded the way they do, there's that option, and we'll continue with some of the discussion questions that we have.
Thanks, Yvette. We do have one question from Ryan Murray. So Ryan, I'm gonna give you like 90 seconds for your question so we can get through some of the other things, because we're getting close here.
Oh, I don't have a question. I'm sorry, I must have hit the wrong button. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Great. That was super easy. Appreciate that. So go ahead to These next two slides are really about continuing to engage the audience in your thoughts and how you're seeing our work either interact with your community, collaborate with your community, your work that you're doing. There's some really great resources that have also been coming from you all in the chat. I'm also feeling the pressure of time, of course. And really want to ask you all, how do you envision that DCYF can partner across programs and community to achieve these goals, right? We know that we are not in this alone, that it will take all of us to do this for multiple systems, for multiple people, mentors, volunteers, friends. So thoughts from you all in the chat around how you can envision DCYF partnering across our programs and with community to achieve these strategic priorities. I'm going to pause there. And Yvette, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll ask the second question as well. The second question is more focused on how should community-driven approaches that center Black, Indigenous, people of color's experiences, how should that look, right? We know when we stated in the beginning, and many of us have lived experiences around being told how to do things or what we're supposed to do. And like Latoya said, nothing about us without us is for us. So what does that look like for you to have a community-driven approach that centers BIPOC experiences? So those are our two big questions. The third one being, what else would you like us to know?
Looks like we have a hand raised from Lisa. And I'll go ahead and unmute. I'll invite you to unmute.
Okay. Lisa?
Hi. I was going back to the first question, I think, about how to, could you go back to that first question about how to integrate the programs? I think I've seen in one of your prior presentations, or maybe the legislature's thing, about how a lot of youth are in cross systems. So what I heard today was a lot of, what I think I heard today was mostly presentation from JRA, but a lot of that same age group has, I would imagine, have an overlap with DCYF Children's Services. So maybe just getting DCYF to partner across their own programs would be a good start.
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. That in part is where Justice Shop steps in. Adolescent programs is one of the first internal collaboration programs that bridges that age group, because you're so right that youth and young adults bridge between child welfare and juvenile rehabilitation services. And part of that building of that is creating the awareness of how those programs are going to reach across and support each other, and also what challenges they might ensue based on, I don't know, mandates or legislations that also looks different. But that's definitely a place to continue to develop and support, is reaching across internally. Being only a few years old, I think many of us just default to our originating agencies and those levels of expertise. And so internally, a lot of conversations about how to break down those internal silos so that we're working more cohesively as one agency.
Oh, I guess I was thinking also for, I guess there's still youth in that age group that are also parents in dependencies. So not just like exiting foster care, but maybe their kids are in foster care and they're trying to get housing, but they're also in that same age group of 18 to 25.
Yeah.
Hey, can I speak to that a little bit?
Of course.
So one of the things that we focus on adolescent programs is really how do we serve youth or adolescents across the continuum. And so an example is, so extended foster care lives in adolescent programs. And so we do a ton of collaboration with child welfare for those youth. We also have programs like independent living, where we're really talking about how do we actually provide these services, not just to youth in foster care, but how do we make independent living skills available to youth who are also either in JR settings or exiting JR settings, so that they can also have those relationships in their communities. We have other examples are education. We have a K-12 education program that we're really trying to look at. How can we support JR in their work to improve institutional educational opportunities for their youth? Where our goal is really to provide a suite of services to adolescents, regardless of where they enter or exit a system, but also how does adolescent programs provide and increase capacity to the entire organization in order to prioritize this, these youth in this developmental stage.
Great, thanks, Jess. Vicki, I see you're unmuted. I just want to double check. Okay. Yvette, shall we move into next steps in the interest of time? Okay. I know there's a lot of beautiful things and suggestions coming into the chat, so we are again taking note of that and keeping those and not wanting anyone to lose sight of the information that's coming in there through there.
So I will invite Vicki to just share a little bit about what to expect in terms of next steps.
Thanks, Yvette. So this is again, just a reminder of our timeline at this point. We hope to have the next draft of the interim integrated strategic and racial equity plan published on our website soon, hopefully next week. This concludes our 3 planned strategic priority webinars around the intention priorities. We will continue to seek targeted feedback from communities of color and affected individuals, as well as from our established advisory groups inside DCYF. Our plan is to have the final strategic plan, integrated strategic and racial equity plan, up on the website April of 2021, hopefully the first week of the month. And then we'll be pivoting to implementation. We are working right now inside the agencies to establish leaders that will be accountable and how they will be accountable. We need to work on metrics that we'll be using to determine success and monitor success. We'll be working to publish those externally. So all of that is work that still remains, but we look forward to it, and we really appreciate all of the great discussion and feedback we received today. Yvette, you're muted.
Thank you, Vicki. So what I was saying was just sharing my appreciation for everyone's time and participation in the webinar today. We have some contact information for Vicki and our team at the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice if you have additional questions about the Integrated Strategic and Racial Equity Plan. We'll also, as we shared in the chat, we'll be posting the next draft of the interim plan on the DCYF website. We'll have all the robust Q&A that was shared during the session today, along with any notes on the website as well. So you can all reference that and please share with your other partners or folks who weren't able to join today in case they would like to also access this information and continue engaging with us in reaching our agency-wide goals. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time.